This lecture starts with one of the 9 muses of Hesiod, the muse of astronomy and astrology. And astrology now, of course, is discredited, but the general idea is not discredited. And so the general idea here is that there was a heightened self-conscious awareness at this time in Greece that not only was the universe ordered, first of all, that the universe was ordered and that we can understand it. So, again, this whole process of going from sensation to memory to experience to aha, that recognition that there's an underlying order. And so this view links together science and art and also ethics and politics, because if the same muse is the muse of astronomy, which is the order of the natural world, and astrology, which is a discussion of the order underlying human emotions and actions, then there's a connection there. It's the same muse that muses about these things. What are called the Presocratic philosophers, what unites them together is that they all came to this realization. They thought about the universe. They started out as scientists, and then they reached that higher level of self-conscious awareness, like Davies and Laszlo and Aristotle talk about. Aristotle says at one point, thought starts thinking itself. So you're thinking about your thinking, and you're realizing that what must the universe be like in order for me to be able to take in these sensations and to be able to order them according to certain patterns and regularities. And what the Presocratics decided was there must be some one first principle that's the source of everything else we see. So there's some unity in the diversity. There's some basic fundamental origin or building block of the universe. And the Presocratics disagreed with each other, and some of them were more materialistic oriented, some of them were more abstract, which still happens today among the scientists. Some of them, Parmenides was sort of the mystic, and Democritus was the atomist. And so I'm just going to talk about the basic self-conscious awareness of the Presocratics. Even if they disagreed with each other, they agreed on the project that that the universe does have a basic building block or principle, and that we are capable of understanding it, and that we ought to understand it, and that we ought to base the way we live on trying to stay in harmony with the universe, trying to stay in touch with it. So the Presocratics tended to live in groups and have a organized lifestyle, so that the kind of order they thought existed in the universe, they tried to imitate in their communities. Okay, so Thales thought all was water, Anaximenes thought all is air, Empedocles all is earth, air, fire, and water, and the things that change are just all end up in a cycle. Anaximander thought all is infinite. Democritus thought all is infinite atoms that move between the full and the void. And Anaxagoras thought there is this principle of mind, or nous, that's different from this infinite array of things that we see. Parmenides said all is one. Heraclitus says everything is constantly changing. The only thing that doesn't change is the law of change. And Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, he writes that he agrees with Heraclitus. So those are the differences. Aristotle himself responds to all of these and comes up with his argument for a first principle, a prior actuality that's pure energy. Aristotle's God, or first principle, is impersonal, although it's kind of funny because when he describes the first principle, he personifies. Sometimes he says, this being, this first principle experiences pleasure, the pleasures of the intellect, which we only experience for a few minutes. And that seems to me making God into a person a lot more than his metaphysical inquiries demanded. And that's another thing that's interesting, is these different scientists, people from all kinds of specialties, they envision the first principle differently. And I think that fits with Hinduism. I think actually many Hindu scholars talk about the comparison between the way the universe is thought of now and Hinduism. And I don't want to go into that because there's so many specialists who know better than I. But what I'll say here is that Hindus thought there were different paths to God. And the two most basic ones are thinking of God as impersonal and thinking of God as a person. And the Hindu Vedas say you have to apologize if you think of God as a person, because God is not a person, but most people need to make God into a person. So none of the people I'm going to refer to make God personify, like Michelangelo, the grandpa figured with the beard, or personify God as getting mad at Moses or something. They don't personify that much, but they do understand God and the mind of God in ways that vary in terms of human anthropomorphizing, I think. And I think that's just because their minds are different in that basic fundamental distinction. But so many of them are coming to some conclusions that there is an underlying order. So the Presocratics were on to something. And they might disagree with Thales that all is water, but it was brilliant for Thales to think, to try and establish some first principle and argue that everything comes from water. So the original, or the basic insight, is thought thinking itself. And I thought I would quote again from Laszlo, just to see the little hook between the first couple of lectures and what I'm going to do now, similarity and difference. He says, we may not be the center of the universe and the final cause of all evolution, but we are concrete embodiments of cosmic processes in their particular terrestrial variation, and we did evolve a most remarkable property, self-reflection. In virtue of this, we may be among the very few species of natural systems in the universe which are able not only to sense the world and respond to it, but to know their own sensations and come to reasoned conclusions about the nature of reality. And that's what I'll describe here about what all of these scientists and specialists are actually doing. They're coming to reasoned conclusion about the nature of reality as a whole. And then the epic poetry and the ones that have imitations of actions like tragedy and art is that people understand they can and they have to come to reasoned conclusions about the nature of the human psyche and the human condition and better and worse ways to create cultures. Okay, so this intuition, Aristotle would say that this understanding, thought, thinking itself, is what nous is, and that's what Laszlo also says. It's the ultimate first principle of the universe, divine nous, and of human beings, the microcosm in the macrocosm. So even though Thales said all is water, it was his nous that was inspired to even ask the question. Nous was the property of the mind that wanted to ask, what is the first principle? And then instead of saying it was nous, he said it was water. So he asked the right question, and his mind woke up. Okay, so you also can argue and that you can compare. I'm going to talk about Einstein here, and I derived a number of quotes from a book by Krista Tippett, who does a public radio program where she interviews different people about their views of God and the universe. And the name of the book is called Einstein's God. And there's a lot of evidence to compare Aristotle with Einstein. He did think there was an ultimate first principle, but on the other hand, we don't have to go back to Aristotle. We can go back to all the Presocratics and say they all thought there was an ultimate first principle. And then I'm going to describe Einstein's idea and then a lot of other scientists. So, first, this is Paul Davies, the theoretical physicist, who's having a conversation with Krista Tippett about Einstein. Davies says, Einstein gave us the so-called general theory of relativity in 1915, on which the notion of the expanding universe is based, and by extension the universe beginning with the so-called Big Bang. We know this is now 13.7 billion years ago. Einstein's theory of relativity says that this was the origin of time. There's no time before that. Einstein was the person to establish the notion of what is sometimes called block time, that the past, present, and future are just personal decompositions of time, and that the universe of past, present, future in some sense has an eternal existence. And so, even though individuals may come and go, their lives, which are in the past for their descendants, nevertheless still have some existence within this block time. Nothing takes that away. You may have your 70 years and 10 measured by a date after your death. You are no more, and yet within this grand sweep of the timescape, nothing is changed. Your life is still there in its eternity. And of course, that sounds like Hinduism also. So, alright, and Aristotle also had the same view of time that Einstein has. Time is a measure of motion. It doesn't exist apart from things in motion. So, Einstein's contribution was to our understanding of space and time, and that is that in fact before Newton and Galileo, ancient cultures thought of time as organic and subjective and cyclical and part of nature. You say that the clock is an emblem of an intellectual straitjacket that was created in a relatively modern era by scientists. Einstein then restored time to its rightful place at the heart of nature. These ideas of physics might seem to echo spiritual notions that you can find in Eastern and Western religious thought, and Einstein himself thought that. He thought that Buddhism was going to be the next great world's religions, but he also had his own kind of religion. Einstein described his own inclination towards another kind of religious sensibility, which he called a cosmic religious sense. He discerned kindred glimpses of this feeling in such diverse figures as the prophets and psalmists of the Hebrew Bible, St. Francis of Assisi, and the Buddha. He wrote, "It's very difficult to elucidate this feeling to anyone who does not experience it. The individual feels the vanity of human desires and aims, and the nobility and marvelous order which are revealed in nature and in the world of thought. Individual existence strikes him as a sort of prison, and he wants to experience the universe as a single significant whole. The religious geniuses of all ages have been distinguished by this kind of religious feeling. In my view, it is the most important function of art and science to awaken this feeling and keep it alive in those who are receptive to it." And of course, I agree with that, and that's why I want to show people how Greek civilization understood that, and we can use that as a model to understand other civilizations or to understand ourselves, basically. Okay, Paul Davies also wrote The Mind of God, and he makes these claims. He starts out with, "It's clear that on the whole the universe is far from being random. We recognize patterns everywhere and codify them into laws which have real predictive power. But the universe is also far from being simple. It possesses a subtle kind of complexity that places it partway between simplicity on the one hand and randomness on the other. One way of expressing this quality is to say that the universe has organized complexity." So the idea there, coming from the Presocratics, is Davies is trying to find a first principle, and that's organized complexity is the one and the many integrated together. Then he says, "There's a feeling among the scientific community that the subjects of cosmology on the one hand, the study of the universe, and the fundamental forces within matter on the other, are coming together to provide a unified description of the cosmos." That's what the Presocratics were doing. "It's a description in which the ultra-microscopic structure of matter is intimately connected to the global structure of the universe, each influencing the development of the other in a delicate and complex fashion. My conclusion, then, is that the physical universe is not compelled to exist as it is. It could have been otherwise. In this case, we are returned to the problem of why it is as it is. If one perseveres with the principle of sufficient reason, and demands a rational explanation for nature, then we have no choice but to seek that explanation in something beyond or outside the physical world, in something metaphysical, because a contingent physical universe cannot contain within itself an explanation for itself. What sort of metaphysical agency must be able to create a universe? It's important to guard against the naive image of a creator producing a universe at some instant in time by supernatural means. Creation cannot consist of merely causing the Big Bang. We are searching instead for a more subtle, timeless notion of creation." Davies' own view is that the seemingly miraculous occurrence of numerical values that nature has assigned to her fundamental constants must remain the most compelling evidence for an element of cosmic design. Further, the apparent fine-tuning of the laws of nature, necessary if conscious life is to evolve in the universe, then carries the clear implication that God has designed the universe so as to permit such life and consciousness to emerge. It would mean that our own existence in the universe formed a central part of God's plan. So Davies envisions a God. He kind of personifies a God as the one who fine-tuned it at the beginning, who had this blueprint. Laszlo would just say that it's a self-generating, self-regulating system, and Aristotle just said there has to be another kind of being in order to explain the material world, and that being has to exist necessarily and has to be a pure actuality. So when I read Davies, I think of him as anthropomorphizing the first principle more than Aristotle does. On the other hand, Aristotle has these queer, weird one or two sentences where he jumps into anthropomorphizing more than I would think. And then Davies says, finally, we who are children of the universe, animated stardust, can nevertheless reflect on the nature of that same universe, even to the extent of glimpsing the rules on which it runs. I cannot believe that our existence in this universe is a mere quirk of fate, an accident of history, an incidental blip in the great cosmic drama. Our involvement is too intimate. The physical species Homo sapien may count for nothing, but the existence of mind in some organism on some planet in the universe is certainly a fact of fundamental significance. Through conscious beings, the universe has generated self-awareness. This can be no trivial detail nor minor byproduct of mindless, purposeless forces. We are truly meant to be here. And again, he seems to be personifying that there's some kind of plan, and maybe we're going to have, I have no idea what he thinks about rendering an account of your life after you die. He does think the mind can exist in some other form, and that's okay. It's just that other people, he does very generously will quote other scientists, because he recognizes that scientists can agree on some kind of first principle, but they envision it, they picture it very differently. So here are some of his descriptions of the other ways that people predict events. He cites various scientists. He says, some prefer to think of God as being itself, or as a creative force, rather than as a mind. Indeed, it may be that minds and forces are not the only agencies that have creative potency. Some of the emerging views, quote, introduce elements of teleology or purposive behavior in the affairs of the world. That would be Laszlo. Davies understands the link between Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy and Aristotle's science. Quote, process thinking leads naturally to an organismic or ecological view of the universe, reminiscent of Aristotle's cosmology. Ian Barber, a Whiteheadian, describes the process vision of reality as the view that the world is a community of interdependent beings rather than a collection of cogs in a machine. Davies cites various scientists' attitudes toward mystical experience. On the one hand, quote, there's no doubt that many scientists are opposed temperamentally to any form of metaphysical, let alone mystical arguments. They are scornful of the notion that there might exist a God, or even an impersonal creative principle or ground of being that would underpin reality and render it contingent, its contingent aspects less starkly arbitrary. On the other hand, many scientists have testified to having their own mystical experiences, among them Einstein, Pauli, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Eddington, Jeans, Hoyle, Feynman, Brian Josephson, and David Bohm. Each of them describes these experiences differently. Some, like Josephson and Bohm, quote, believe that regular mystical insights achieved by quiet meditative practices can be a useful guide in the formulation of scientific theories. Unquote. Others experience something like Rudy Rucker describes. It's possible to jump out of the system and experience the absolute for oneself. Mystical knowledge is attained all at once or not at all. There's no gradual path. Well, maybe there is for some people and not other people. And Buddhists, many Buddhists connect their meditative practices with insights about the universe. Many Hindus do that. The Tao of physics, Taoists can do this. The dance of the woolly masters is a theoretical physicist who the vision of Shiva dancing is a symbolic image of all the particles in the universe. And then Davies quotes Richard Feynman, who says, all the sciences, and not just the sciences, but all the efforts of intellectual kinds, are an endeavor to see the connections of the hierarchies, to connect beauty to history, to connect history to man's psychology to the working of the brain to the neural impulse to the chemistry, and so forth, up and down both ways. And today we cannot, and it is no use making believe that we can, draw carefully a line all the way from one end of this to the other, because we have only just begun to see that there is this relative hierarchy, and I do not think either end is nearer to God. Well, I have to differ with them about we've only begun to see that there is this hierarchy. I mean, really. Hindus thought of this a long time ago, and the Presocratics thought of it a long time ago. So I do think we should get over being a little too full of ourselves, and also realize that the insights of Einstein and then quantum physics bring us back to wisdom literature. Okay, so here's some other ones, some other quotes. Sherwin Nuland is a professor of surgery at Yale, and this is one of the people that Kristen Tippett interviewed. He says, Nuland looks within the body not only for the source of his wonder, but for the driving force of the capacity for wonder itself. He makes the provocative suggestion that what we call the human spirit, our capacity for beauty and love, our drive to create balance in life and moral order in society, is an evolutionary accomplishment of the most complex organism on the planet, the human brain. Within our very beings, he says, we sense the threat of chaos, we sometimes yield to it, but overwhelmingly, individually and collectively, we seek balance. We transcend mere impulse and reason. Sherwin Nuland has given himself over to charting transcendence rooted in flesh and blood and bone, DNA and neurotransmitter and enzyme. And I would say that the other neuroscientist that I know of, Joseph Damasio, also connects spirituality in every meaningful sense with biology and the recent discoveries of neuroscience. Okay, and here's a writer from Cambridge who's spent his career studying Darwin, and he argues that Darwin had this basic insight consistent with Einstein, except in relation to biology. Einstein did not reject the idea of a force or mind behind the universe, but he saw it expressed in natural laws that could be discerned and described. In a similar way, Darwin saw creation as an unfolding reality. Once set in motion as he saw it, the laws of nature sustained a self-organizing progression driven by the needs and struggles of every aspect of creation itself. The word reverence would not be too strong to describe the attitude with which Darwin approached all that he saw in the natural world. There's a great intellectual and spiritual passion and a touching sense of wonder evident in his writings, from his primitive notebooks and private notebooks and correspondence to the Beagle Diary and the Origin of Species. In describing a creation that organized itself, incorporating chaos and change into survival and progress, Darwin did not challenge the idea of God as the source of all being, but he did reject the idea of a God minutely implicated in every flaw and injustice and catastrophe. And yeah, that's excess personification of God is consistently rejected by these intellectuals. Okay. Here's another quote from Darwin. How have all these exquisite adaptations of one part of the organization to another part, and to the conditions of life, and of one distinct organic being to another being been perfected? We see these beautiful co-adaptations most plainly in the woodpecker and mistletoe, and only a little less plainly in the humblest parasite, which clings to the hairs of a quadruped or feathers of a bird, in the structure of a beagle which drives through the water, in the plum seed which is wafted by the gentlest breeze. In short, we see beautiful adaptations everywhere. And the thing that's so interesting about that is it sounds exactly like Aristotle when he's justifying how much time he spent studying plants and animals. He says we see this underlying order everywhere, and it's a species of the beautiful. It's a source of wonder. And so the underlying principle is order is prior to disorder, and actuality is prior to potentiality, as I said before. But the universe is this combination of necessity and contingency, the one and the many, a system that is self-regulating but also self-evolving. Okay, then there's a astrophysicist. So the last two people I'm going to quote are focused mostly on mathematics. And the point I wanted to make here was about another great Presocratic was Pythagoras. And he thought all is number. And so many physicists today understand the mathematical order underneath things and draw different conclusions about whether the laws of physics cause the universe, or the mathematical formulas are the cause, or simply the description of the universe. And Aristotle actually and Plato had a dialogue, a disagreement with Pythagoras about whether number was the cause, the first principle, or whether there was another first principle that was a principle of order, and number is simply the measure of that order. And so Plato and Aristotle would come out on the side of mind is the first principle, and it orders things, and number is our way of measuring that order. But anyway, so Jana Levin, who teaches at at Barnard, is an astrophysicist, and she says, I'm absolutely struck with the power of mathematics, and that's why I'm a theoretical physicist. If I want to answer questions, I love that we can all share the mathematical answers. If I were ever to lean towards spiritual thinking or religious thinking, it would be in that way. It would be, why is it that there's this abstract mathematics that guides the universe? Okay, so she frames it as the math guides the universe, like it's the cause. So that would make her more Pythagorean. Instead of the math measures the universe, that has a foundation of order. Anyway, she says the universe is remarkable. Why is it that abstract mathematics guides the universe? The universe is remarkable because we can understand it. That's what's remarkable. All the other things are remarkable too. It's really, really astounding that these little creatures on this little planet that seem totally insignificant in the middle of nowhere can look back over the 14 billion year history of the universe and understand so much and in such short a time. So that's where I would get a sense of meaning and purpose and of beauty and of being integrated with the universe, so that it doesn't feel hopeless and meaningless. Now, I don't personally invoke a God to do that, but I can't say that mathematics would disprove the existence of God either. So there are other thinkers, like Stephen Weinstein, who agree on the wonder and the intelligibility, but then conclude that it's all meaningless and purposeless. And that really boggles my mind, because it seems arrogant to me to need to have any sense of meaning and purpose greater than simply we can understand it. Aristotle, remember the first sentence of the Metaphysics, all human beings by nature seek understanding, and we wonder about things, especially we value our eyes because they help us make distinctions in things, the power of sight. And so that is the meaning and purpose of life. And we know so why do we need another one? Why can't we say we're meant to be here? The universe evolved this self-conscious awareness, and we also know we need to live within natural limits. There's a natural ethics, there's a natural politics, there's natural virtue and justice, there's a natural function for the arts. What more purpose do we need? And so the Greeks also emphasized, given what we do know, your responsibility, what you want to think about, is the legacy that you leave behind to the next generation. So are you leaving behind a natural world that's not interfered with, that's functioning well because you learned how to establish human culture in a way that was sustainable? Have you learned how to negotiate with other countries to prevent war and disruption and chaos and negativity? Have you developed harmony and prosperity and a move toward higher and higher levels of flourishing in the relation between nations, in your own community, in your own life, and then pass that on to your children? It's like, what more do we need in order to know how to live? Why is that a meaningless and purposeless life? But people just picture things differently, and I don't get that at all. Something inside of me suspects that it comes from a tradition where the holy books have this anthropomorphized God, and so people feel like they either have to accept that or think life is meaningless and purposeless. And of course that's a complete false dilemma at this point. And people are starting to realize that Einstein's view changed things and brought back wisdom literature, and that theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, is consistent with some of these ancient notions of the one and the many. And then finally, my last article is by Frank Wilczek, who teaches physics at MIT and won a Nobel Prize in 2004. And this one is really interesting, where he brings back Pythagoras and Plato. Pythagoras and Plato intuited that the world should embody beautiful ideas, or order. Newton and Maxwell demonstrated how the world could embody beautiful ideas. Finally, in the 20th century, in modern physics, and especially in quantum physics, we find a definitive answer. Yes, the world does embody beautiful ideas. Okay, so then he talks about the Pythagorean theorem. He says it's telling you that the geometry of objects embodies hidden numerical relationships. It says, in other words, that number describes, if not yet everything, at least something very important about physical reality, namely the size and shapes of the objects that inhabit it. Pythagoras is also responsible for another startling, impressive realization of the idea that all things are number. That's Pythagoras' first principle. Pythagoras is exposing another of his great discoveries. If you pluck strings which are under tension by weights that are in simple numerical proportions, ratios of small whole numbers, and or strings stopped so that their lengths are in simple numerical proportions, you get tones that sound pleasant together. We say that they are in harmony. This is another startling relationship bridging things. Here, the world of perceptions, of sounds, and of number. So, Pythagoras would talk about the harmony of the spheres. It's great. And then he talks about Plato. All this made a tremendous impression on Plato, and through Plato it was transmitted down the centuries. Plato, among many other things, is famous for the Platonic solids. They are solids whose faces are all identical regular polygons. In fact, equilateral triangles, squares, or regular pentagons. Just 5 shapes, no more and no less. Euclid's Elements ends with the construction of these Platonic solids, and many people conjecture that Euclid intended that to be an appropriate climax to his work. That requiring symmetry can pin down a few specific, discrete possibilities for structure was a striking discovery. It inspired Plato to propose a theory of everything that, while primitive, is still very much in the spirit of modern ideas. I can't accept Plato's theory in detail, but the idea that there are exactly 5 things and that you can use to construct the world, and that these things embody mathematical principles, is a remarkable kind of intuition. So again, it's that same intuitive sense of some basic principles. Now, Plato thought mind was the first principle of order, and then you could measure it through these solids. Okay, Plato also described a more philosophical concept, his metaphor of the cave. According to this metaphor, as human beings, we perceive not ultimate reality, but only a sort of projection, mere shadows on the wall of a cave. Plato's message was that the world, at its most fundamental level, could embody beauty, despite paltry or messy appearances. One of our goals as thinkers, philosophers, or just appreciators of the world should be to imagine, from the projections we perceive, what the real thing is. Plato believed that the real thing would be more perfect, more beautiful, and more spacious than the projection. Yet there must be a precise mapping from the underlying reality to the projection, and that is how you can test and refine your ideas about what the underlying reality is. And when I talk about Plato, I'll talk about the cave, obviously. So his conclusion is, the quantum description of atoms realizes Pythagoras' vision uncannily. The mathematics of electrons and atoms is exactly the same mathematics that people developed to describe musical instruments. The equations for vibrations of the air within a woodwind instrument specifically bear a strong family resemblance to the equations we use to describe the motion of electrons in atoms. When the woodwind is sounding a pure tone, inside it there's a space-dependent pattern of density and pressure that oscillates in time. We call it a standing wave. The stationary states are aesthetically attractive, and the more you know, the more profoundly attractive they become, as you understand that they are the solution of precise mathematical equations, whose consequences have been checked down to the 9th decimal. Nor do the two-dimensional projections do them justice. They have a lot of internal spatial structure. It's wonderful to think that inside us, as our substance, we find structure that is fabulously intricate and pretty to visualize, that embodies precise equations whose consequences we can check in fantastic detail. The big idea is that in theoretical physics, we've gone from observing symmetry in equations that experiments lead us to proposing equations with enormous symmetry and asking nature's verdict on them. In other words, we are trying to use beauty actively as our guiding principle rather than as something we observe passively. We've become artists, but artists with a difference. We voluntarily submit our work to a hopefully loving, but in any case unimpeachable critic, Mother Nature. So, so that, in my view, is how the frontier of our approach to understanding the deep structure of physical reality, realizing the dreams of Pythagoras and Plato, building on the insights of Newton and Maxwell, looks today. The prospects are tantalizing. And so what I want to suggest is that Muse, he sees Muse of astronomy and astrology, just that basic intuition that there's a first principle and that we can understand it and it will be our guide for how to live. If there's a first principle in the universe, there's going to be some first principles in the human soul, and then how human beings should live. And so that concept of a principle of order is being embraced by people from many different disciplines, and they're coming together and they envision the first principle differently, but they're all kind of amazed. A lot of them are going back to ancient traditions, and I'm just choosing the Greek tradition, and I'm also linking it all back to the notion of nous, because even if they don't say nous is the ultimate principle, you can either argue that it is, that's why math works, or and you can say that people envision that first principle differently, and even when Thales says the first principle is water, the intuition was that there is one, and our destiny is to understand it. And so a healthy human being is raised to seek understanding, to emotionally desire what it is we're destined to. Our only kind of flourishing, the only way we can really flourish as human beings, is to cultivate that desire to understand, and to cultivate it through science, through the arts, through politics, through ethics, through our roles as parents, spouses, friends, creators of community, creators of laws and institutions, all the other things we do. We're seeking that underlying order. We're seeking to follow those principles. We're seeking to harmonize so that the microcosm in our minds and in our hearts is in tune with the macrocosm.